Now, you had mentioned that you were eventually declared an expert, like undercover nuclear spy, meaning you're working in weapons of mass destruction and things that affect our national security interests here in the United States. When approximately did that happen? 5 years in, 10 years in?
That was in about, let's see, probably about 10 years in, yeah. So I spent about the latter 15 years of my career focusing primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on preventing nuclear weapons or biological weapons technology from spreading from countries that have it to countries that don't have it.
Now, did that happen because you happened to recruit a slew of undercover assets who were in that realm and had access to that information, so you were already having success there?
Yes, that's exactly it. They saw that I had a certain talent for recruiting people in those programs. And so when I came back from overseas in about 94, then they wanted me to continue in the Counterproliferation Operations Directorate.
Now, yes, so this is just thinking about the time period, too, that you were around, because it was 1980 to 2005, right?
Correct.
So you worked through the closeout days of the Soviet Union.
Right.
The growing days of what wasn't exactly a successful growth of Russia.
Right.
The 9/11 and the war on terror and the destabilization that occurred in the Middle East, specifically in the build-up to that in the 90s. This was a very, very interesting time. And at the end of your career, you're there during the whole WMD Iraq thing and all that. So naturally, at home, all of us understand the significance, at least like passively, of when we say weapons of mass destruction and what nuclear bombs are capable of, to say nothing of biological weapons. That's something I want to ask you about later. But how, in your experience, like, did you see a lot of situations where you sat back and said, if only people knew how close we just came?
Well, I think in the case of Libya, for example, Libya was acquiring nuclear weapons technology from Dr. A.Q. Khan, the father of the Islamic bomb in Pakistan. He was doing this on his own. He was not doing this with the Pakistani government's knowledge. He just took it on himself to take proliferation private. And so he and his network were supplying Muammar Gaddafi, a sworn enemy of the United States, and Libya with nuclear weapons technology, not just uranium enrichment technology, but also real working diagrams of nuclear weapons that we knew would work. And as you may recall, Muammar Gaddafi he ultimately declared those nuclear weapons and to the United States, and the United States took all of that stuff out of Libya because Libya decided that they would rather be a friend of the United States than an enemy. So this is one of his few lucid moments where he did something really smart. I think part of it was undoubtedly influenced by the fact of seeing Saddam Hussein fall for not declaring, whatever weapons he might have had. And he thought, it's better to be a friend of the U.S. than an enemy. And Libya has one of the most wealthy oil and gas reserves in the world, and they needed a modern American technology to fully exploit those oil and gas fields. So he directed his head of intelligence, a man named Musa Kusa, to conduct secret negotiations with the United States and Great Britain to see what it would take to normalize diplomatic relations to ones where we would exchange embassies and have normal relations rather than hostile relations. And our bottom line demand was you have to give up all your WMD programs. Whatever you have to give it up. And he agreed. Unfortunately, his negotiators didn't really get the message, or maybe they were on the take, and they didn't really come clean at our negotiations as to what they possessed. Now, my program, an operation I was running, had penetrated the AQ Khan network. We knew exactly what was going on, and we knew that the Libyans, were acquiring actual working diagrams of nuclear weapons. The same yield, by the way, that destroyed Hiroshima, 14 kilotons, capable of killing 140,000 people.
Did you have, I just want to make sure I understood what you just said correctly, did you have a network of CIA undercovers who reported to you as well? Or when you say your network, are you just talking about your assets?
So I had on my team, just put it that way.
Yeah.
I had on my team people who helped penetrate the network, and then I personally penetrated the network by recruiting spies inside of the AQCon network. Ultimately, what's what we call human intelligence, HUMINT. I mean, we depended upon SIGINT, which is signals intelligence, CyberInt, which is, if we penetrate your computers. Ultimately, though, what you really want is a well-placed spy. You want to recruit somebody on the other side. So we recruited some penetrations of the CON network, and through that, we were able to bring the entire thing down and get the nuclear weapons technology out of Libya. We basically called the Libyans' bluff and said, we know for a fact. In fact, we stopped a ship called the BBC China in 2004. This BBC China had hundreds of thousands of components for a nuclear weapons program, for uranium enrichment up to highly enriched uranium. And so we stopped that, seized those 40-foot containers, and so we called the Libyans' bluff and said, you can't sell us this fable that you don't have a nuclear weapons program because we just took these containers off this boat. That was all due to my team's intelligence collection. So he declared it. We got the nuclear weapons technology out of Libya. A few years later, in 2011, so this was only about 6 or 7 years later.
So that was like your crowning achievement at the end, it sounds like.
Well, a few years later, you may recall that Gaddafi was overthrown.
Yes.
And a friend of mine once said, Jim, if your team had not basically discovered what he was doing and then enabled us to take those nuclear weapons out of Libya, think what he would have done with actual working nuclear weapons against his own people, or maybe create a distraction in Europe by using one of those weapons.
You weren't concerned that he would try to use one against America, who he viewed as the primary enemy?
Sure, but you need a delivery system capable of launching it that far. It was much more likely that he would have used it against his own people, or Europe is just across the Mediterranean. So, everything depends on a delivery system.
So I'm just trying to think, though, the AQCon guy, I might be totally wrong here, but is that the same dude who met with Osama bin Laden in the hills of Pakistan, where bin Laden famously said, according to U.S. intelligence, who says we don't already have nuclear weapons?
That wasn't him. It was another guy that's similar to him. I don't remember the man's name. But, yeah, you're right. Somebody did, a Pakistani nuclear scientist did meet with Osama bin Laden. Now, we were very concerned that at that same time that Khan might be talking to al-Qaeda, but he didn't. He was not doing that.
Interesting. Because I always hear, like, when I talk with people, especially about, like, Pakistan, it's, what's the line they say? Like, Bustamante said this line for sure. Some other people did too, though. It's like, it's about who's paying the most or something like that. Like, they'll just go with, like, including their intelligence service and everything, like, they're all over the place. And if someone's offering them money, like, they'll give them information, and they're not reliable.
Well, I don't know if it's that easy, but clearly we had a very big concern that in Pakistan you have an unfortunate convergence of both state and non-state, meaning terrorist interests. And there's some people in Pakistan who probably have a few fuses burned out in the back of their head on the subject of religion and might be willing to assist a terrorist group. So we were always concerned about that. In the case that you just mentioned of the Pakistani scientist meeting with Osama bin Laden, it was not Dr. Khan, but it was somebody else that was a skilled scientist.
Got it. One of the things I keep on just being amazed by talking with you because of the exact type of intelligence work you did is that very clearly, even without going to specifics as you did with Libya there, you were dealing with so many different countries around the world, significantly different cultures. I mean, I could play fantasy football in my head with all the types of countries you probably had some sort of intelligence work in over the years, over a 25-year period, and it's like, these are wildly different. Like, they don't... If you're dealing with someone in Ukraine, the things that appeals to that person have very little or nothing in common with someone you're dealing with in Iran or something like that. So how much like you're one person. How much, like, what did you do to be able to not blend in, obviously, but to not draw attention and actually understand, like, be on a level culturally with the different people you dealt with?
So there is a veneer of culture. You're right, a cultural veneer. However, there are certain human basic needs. You may recall from college, Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
So you got food, shelter, your children, your loved ones. Well, it doesn't matter if you're an Iranian, a Libyan, a Chinese, a North Korean. If you are a North Korean and your boss has just berated you and treated you like scum, you're going to hate that guy. And if there's a way you can get back at him, we used to talk about hard targets. My contention is there are no hard targets, that every human being, basically, their cultures may be slightly different, the cuisine is different, the language is different, but the basic human needs are the same. And therefore, if I can get access to somebody, then I'm confident that I could probably recruit them over time. Sometimes it takes me a long time, but to detect the stress. I used to be a rock climber. I don't know if you've ever done any rock climbing,
Nope.
Julian. Well, in order to climb a rock, you look for the crack patterns, because that's how you put your fingers and your toes, as you climb the rock. You can't climb smooth rock. You have to look for crack patterns. And you can't tell those crack patterns from a long way off. You have to get near the rock and study it. And people have crack patterns. They have emotional crack patterns. And so my talent was be able to detect what the stress is in your life, what's upsetting you. And then over time, I can figure that out. In one case, it took me 11 years. The person didn't have any detectable vulnerabilities or crack patterns that I could see. But over time, things changed in his life. And finally, at about the 10.5-year mark, I started detecting what those crack patterns were. His case, he and I had a fabulous relationship. In fact, it was a very close fraternal relationship, very good friends. We were both long-distance runners. We'd go running together. He'd share a lot of things, but nothing sensitive with me. And he was on top of the world. He was from a country where his particular ethnic group at that time was the predominant one. And he was from that ethnic group. He was young. He was single. He was well-paid, very bright, very competent at what he did. He didn't have any cracks, none that I could see. Certainly nothing that was where it would be justifying a recruitment pitch, even though we would have loved to have recruited this guy.
What type of job did he have?
He was a diplomat,
Okay.
just like me. In fact, I cold called him and asked him to lunch, and then over lunch, we discovered that we both liked to go running, and so we started running once a week. I'd say three Saturdays out of 4, he and I would go running. And when you go run, you share a lot of details and a lot of things. You could joke and you have a good time. And so we became quite close, but there were no crack patterns that I could see. Well, I moved away from that country to another country, but we stayed in touch. And one day he called me and asked me if I'd come back and be his best man at his wedding. He was going to marry a lady from this country. And yeah, when I'm coming after you, you and I are going to be buddies.
Holy shit.
So I was best man at his wedding. And the night before the wedding,
Oh, no.
I just kind of showed him a little bit of what we call, show him a little bit of thigh. I just said, you and I are like brothers. And I meant that. And I said, if you ever have a problem, I've got special connections in Washington and I can help you. And he, nodded and everything. I was not breaking cover, technically.
No, that's a great way to do it.
Floating a thing, that we were so close. Obviously, I'm your best man.
Yeah.
And so anyways, he gets married. He goes off to another country a couple of years later. Turns out his wife, I guess, did not sign on for being 10,000 miles from home. And they'd had a child by then, but she was very upset being so far from home, and ultimately she divorced him. And by the way, if you detect a pattern here where I go after divorced people, headquarters named me Dr. Divorce for a while, because divorce is such a psychologically and financially tumultuous time. It's a horrible time in people's lives. So he gets divorced. The ex-wife, takes their baby daughter and goes home. And then he, about a year and a half later, gets reposted back to his home country after having been gone for 6 or 7 years.
Oh, so he married a woman from the country he was in.
From the country where he and I were both posted before.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he goes home, and in the time that he had been gone from his home country, his ethnic group had lost their predominance. And now there was a new group in charge, and he discovered, to his horror, that no matter how hard he worked, no matter what he did, he could never get promoted beyond a certain grade. And he found that so frustrating. He wrote me an email, and he said, Jim, he said, I don't understand how a country can treat people like that and expect them to give allegiance to that country. Well, that's like a big sign saying, come recruit me. I'm now disaffected. He was so upset. So I urged him to meet me in another country. He was going to go visit his ex-wife and see the baby daughter on her birthday. And that took me maybe 30 seconds to break cover and offer him a job to be on my team. And he said, well, now I've got something to believe in. And so he went on, and he was fabulous at what he did. In fact, he told me later, he said, when 9/11 happened, and he saw those twin towers coming down in New York, he became very emotional at his business, at his foreign ministry. And he became so emotional that some of his colleagues were asking him, why are you so emotionally invested in this? You're not an American. And he said, Jim, they didn't know. I'm on your team now.
Wow.
So he went on, had a successful career, ultimately started a business, still has the business today. It's done very well.
Do you still talk with him?
Through email and things, yeah, I still do.
In Encrypted email?
Yeah. But he jokingly sometimes says, I wish I had a picture of you. I could put it up in my business. And the caption would be our founder.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I love the guy. I mean, he and I, we refer to each other as brothers. And, I mean, we truly, this was one of the guys I recruited I had genuine affection for. And so it was never, I didn't have to search out good things. He was a good person.
And you're saying he has a business now?
Right. He retired from his government, and now he has his own business.
I mean, I think this is probably an easy question to answer. Maybe I don't have to ask it, but is this guy from like a totalitarian-ish type country?
It's one that could go that way, but yeah, I mean, it's. I'm not going to provide any more details, but believe me, his particular ethnic group, they're now second or third class citizens, and that's something that when you feel like that, it's a devastating thing. Like suddenly, no matter how hard I work, there's a glass ceiling. I can't do anything. How can I give allegiance to a country that treats me like that? So in essence, like I said at the beginning of this program, it doesn't feel like they're betraying anything because they've been betrayed.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a few places that could be. I'll ask you off camera. But it's wild to me how you can develop a relationship for so long, and then when you sense that, like you were saying earlier, and you get to that point where it's like, ooh, time to go, I'm going to get a yes if I go right now, that in 30 seconds it can just shift like that. Like you said, he was literally like, well, now I have someone to play for.
Yeah. He's now on my team. And we were already close, so he wanted to be on my team. I'm the team captain, but he's part of my team.
That's still, like, it's amazing that there's not, like, it seems like the way you explain it, he had no level of shock there. Like, oh, Jim's in the CIA? Like, it was like, okay, cool, I'm in.
I think I prefaced my comments by saying, you may have suspected this, but I know you wanted to protect me, and I want to protect you. And I've never seen a need to tell you who I really work for. And I really work for the CIA, and I'd like you to be on my team. And he said, yeah, now I've got something to believe in.
Smooth way to say it, sir. That's pretty good. But you mentioned the image that he described of 9/11 and seeing that and becoming emotional.
Right.
You've been on the same team this whole time. You're from America. It's your country and everything. And at that point, when that happens, you're over 20 years in the CIA. You're, I would imagine, one of their senior spies at that point.
That's correct.
Okay. that wasn't a weapons of mass destruction event. It was a truly insane operation that they pulled off that was horrifying in every level, but it did represent the worst terrorist attack that this country has ever seen and hopefully will ever see. When you see something like that, though, I would imagine there's a part of you that thinks that everything in the world suddenly is very fragile, because that's the type of event that can cause not just your country, but all kinds of countries everywhere to get very tight and perhaps escalate some things, for lack of a better word. Like, what goes through, what's the full thought process that goes through your head, though, and how much did that change your approach to doing the job? Like, did a lot more urgency come into you needing to get new assets, and also, like, how did the goals change?
Well, it certainly added emphasis. At the time, I was working basically on the operation I referred to earlier, the AQ Khan operation. So here's a man who is spreading nuclear weapons, which, as horrible as 9/11 was, where we lost 3,300 Americans in a single day, a nuclear weapon could do maybe anywhere from 10 to 100 times that or more.
Yeah.
So it would be much, much worse. And therefore, we had to have extra emphasis, more acceleration of the operational pace to make sure that Dr. Khan did not transfer any more of that nuclear weapons technology, and that we got what had been transferred out of Libya. At the time, you may recall, Libya was a state sponsor of terrorism. So even though it was unlikely that Gaddafi would give that to a terrorist group, he might. And
what groups were they sponsoring?
Well, he was certainly not a fan. Gaddafi was not a fan of Al-Qaeda, but he had sponsored some of the Red Brigades in Europe, some of the other terrorist groups in Europe. Those were Libyan-sponsored, the Irish Republican Army, some others that were Libyan. Terrorist groups. The Red Brigades in Germany and Spain and France.
They sponsored the IRA?
Oh yeah, they were. Yes, they did.
What's Libya's interest in doing that?
Just to prick the West. It was not anything. I mean, they had no cultural, no religious commonality, nothing. But they supported a number of terrorist groups. Didn't support Al-Qaeda.
Why was that?
I think there were some religious differences. And, of course, Gaddafi would pretend to be religious, but he really wasn't. Yeah. A lot of people do, for that matter, let's be honest. But he, would. And so he was never a fan of Al-Qaeda. But not out of the realm of possibility that if he had nuclear weapons technology and actually working nuclear weapons, then some terrorist group might get them. So it added a lot of acceleration and emphasis that we need to accelerate the pace of this operation and stop this.
And what about I'm sure the question you got to get all the time comes back to Iraq and what happened there. Because, just to be transparent about my stance on this whole thing, when people go to relitigate the past, including me, there is that hindsight 20/20 bias with things. And you can claim that certain things were absolutely ironclad that really weren't at the time based on the information you had, and run with a narrative. So when I look at this, I do always say to people, yeah, we had to go to Afghanistan when that happens. And frankly, for the first while there, we did a great job. I mean, that was outside of bin Laden getting out of the country, almost everything that needed to happen there in, say, that first year that needed to go right went right.
It went extremely right. In fact, I just lost one of my best friends, Gary Sharon, who led our forces, CIA forces, into Afghanistan about 2 weeks after 9/11. He led a small group of CIA paramilitary officers in, and they were on the ground long before our military special forces were there. But, and then they made it, basically expelled the Taliban, expelled Al-Qaeda, and it ended up they didn't get bin Laden, but they were extremely courageous people who did this. Poor Gary passed away at the end of July.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, dear friend.
Well, that's another thing. Like, as a side note, when they went in there, this is something I don't hear a lot of people, like, reanalyze, but it's so interesting to me. This all happened within a few days of those, within like a week of those towers coming down. They were there, but the way we did that military operation was so unlike anything we'd ever done, because the way I understood it, Bush basically said to George Tenet, who was the director of the CIA at the time, if you had to do X, Y, and Z to get done, what would need to happen? And I will make it happen. And so Tenet set up a system in coordination with the military where your friend Gary there, along with other people at the CIA, were essentially sent in as like, say, like Black Ops CIA officers to get assets on the ground and be able to take over villages and work the way across the country with the assistance of the military, where it seemed like the CIA was kind of calling the shots. Is that fair to say?
The CIA had pre-existing contacts, especially with the Northern Alliance. There's different ethnic groups in Pakistan, and the Northern Alliance was opposed to the Taliban, unlike some of the folks in the southern part of the country. But, Gary's, one of his big strengths was he knew these people. He spoke their language. He told me that when he was greeted on the ground by these various Afghan warlords, I think 75% of them, he knew these people. Mm-hmm. So we had existing relationships that had been cultivated over a long period of time. They trusted us and we trusted them. And so together, we then, along with the military who came in, they basically kicked the Taliban out, kicked al-Qaeda out, and did this in a remarkably short period of time. We're talking about weeks.
Yeah, it was fast.
It was very fast.
There was the line, I think Kofor Black said it, where he's like, these guys are going to have spiders crawling across their eyes or something.
Yeah, basically he said, I'll bring bin Laden's head on a spike. Yeah, Kofor, great guy. And other people too, Hank Crumpton, Rick Prado. Rick Prado just wrote Black Ops, great guy, is a good friend of mine. These people were the ones that were directing our forces in Afghanistan and did a remarkably courageous job. Every American should be proud of them.
Yeah, and I feel like it was the ultimate injustice how things ended in Afghanistan, because it was so many years later. And again, it's like that felt like a slow death of a situation, because you could kind of see that happening even a decade ago. Like, this is, they're still there.
Well, Americans have a short time attention span. We get distracted by other things. Yeah. And sure enough, Taliban creeps back in. And pretty soon, we've lost it, and it's just a total waste of blood and treasure. Yeah,
and that's exactly what I was getting at with all this, because the way I always say it is, I do always separate the people who went there. People in the military, they go where they're told to go, they do the job. Right. Like I have a tremendous amount of respect for that, and I don't want to be misheard on that. But like when I look at the Iraq War is like what took our eye off the ball from Afghanistan.
I agree.
And other things.
If we had not been distracted by Iraq, the Taliban wouldn't be back in Afghanistan today, in my opinion.
I agree. I don't see a good argument even against that. I think that's probably what would be the case. But it's interesting to talk with you, because your expertise was in the field undercover with nuclear arms deals and things like that. And it's like the whole reason we went to Iraq was because they had WMD. And that turned out to not be true.
That's exactly right. Now, people ask me about that sometime, and it is true that Saddam Hussein had been working on nuclear weapons before then. He had used chemical weapons against the Kurds. The Kurds are an ethnic group there in Iraq, killed thousands of them. In fact, one of his cousins was known as Chemical Ali. And Chemical Ali used chemical weapons on the Kurds. They'd used them on the Iranians when the Iran-Iraq War.
Was that sarin gas?
Among other things.
Okay.
But yeah, various chemical weapons. Sarin was one of them. And they were working on ballistic missiles. They had been working on, nuclear weapons beforehand. It was a terribly tragic set of circumstances. Saddam Hussein basically could have avoided all this if he had been truly honest and candid about their nuclear weapons program. But he wanted to give off the image that maybe he had nuclear weapons because they live in a tough neighborhood.
Right.
So ultimately that cost him his life. It cost a lot of Iraqis' lives. It cost a lot of American lives. So, it was like deception upon deception. And nobody could argue. He used to have these. He's probably still got them. Saddam Hussein was a jackass. He was a terrible person. I mean, literally like an Adolf Hitler. And so it would be hard to come to Saddam Hussein's defense and say, yeah, he's gotten rid of everything. It must have been, I think, some poor analysis, some other things, maybe a bit of pandering. Saddam Hussein's a bad guy, so we pander to the White House, and we're going to go in and clean house. Maybe. I don't know. I was not involved in the Iraqi WMD issues. I was absolutely focused 100% on on other nuclear weapons issues, the Iranians, the AQ Khan operation, things like that. I never actually participated in any of the Iraqi WMD ops.
That is weird to me. That's really weird to me.
I didn't see an op to participate in, so.
Still, like that was, again, at this point, when this is all going down after 9/11, you are a very senior officer, successful. Right. This is your expertise. This is what you've been doing. This was the only, not that you don't have a focus everywhere on nuclear weapons at all times. I know you do. And when the average person thinks about it, they realize, well, of course they do. But at the time, like, you listen to the media, you listen to everything, all the focus is on one country with nuclear weapons, and we're deciding whether or not to put what's going to end up being billions, trillions of dollars into a war there.
Right.
And you're not involved?
I'm not involved, no.
That's a CIA mistake right there.
Well, it could be, but I would have been looking for nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, okay, and it's hard.
The tinfoil hat just got on my head, I'll tell you that.
It's harder to prove a negative than it is a positive, and we had no telltale signs there. I was read into all of the intelligence that we had. I mean, read in, meaning I had access to this. But I was devoting literally 99.99% of my time to defeating AQ Khan and his we knew he had nuclear weapons technology. We knew this was going to a hostile country, Libya. We suspected there was going to be another country after that one. And so we had to stop that. So I had I guess you could say, the luxury of devoting all of my attention to that.
Interesting. All right, very quick question, because then I'm going to explain why. But did you enjoy working for George Tenet?
I love the guy.
Yeah.
I told George, he's a good friend of mine, I told him, if I ever write your biography, the title is going to be The Spy Who Loved Us.
Yeah.
Because he is a natural, he was not trained as a case officer, but he's an extremely warm, charismatic person who absolutely cared about his people, 100%. And I love the guy.
All right, we're going to get along well on this, because you just said exactly what my interpretation of him is. So that's a guy, when all the people out there throw on their anti-CIA, no matter what, conspiracy hats, he's an easy target for people. Because in my opinion, seeing as the CIA was formed technically after World War II, George Tenet from 97 to 2004 was at the helm of the hardest years in the history of the CIA. I can't think of a more tumultuous time as far as how many things were going on and what the threat level was on a, no pun intended, nuclear scale.
Well, it was incredible. His memoirs were entitled "At the Center of the Storm."
I read it, yeah.
And he was absolutely one of the he was certainly the best CIA director I ever served under, and I served under about 7 or 8 of them. He was the best and genuinely cared about us. Personally, I feel like he was misled by some people on the WMD issue, and he's had to pay the emotional price for that.
And the personal price, too.
But if he had known that there were no WMD, we would not have gone to war in Iraq. But he didn't know that. He was being told by people that he trusted and counted on that we've got a case, we've got, to do it.
And who were those people?
I'm not going to say.
Not their names, but like
there
what
were
types of...
senior analysts that were maybe they sensed that this is the answer he wants to hear, or what the White House wants to hear. This is what I call pandering.
Yes.
This is when you tell somebody something, you whisper in their ear something they want to hear, even though you know it's not true. I don't know that anybody was 100% deceptive, but they were assuming something that just wasn't there. But George Tenet, absolutely the best director I ever served under, and one of the strongest directors we ever had. He cared about us.
Yeah, see, I'm not one of these people. I look at things on the facts as best I can, and also integrating in that, you know, human beings are imperfect too, and I try to give everyone their fair shake, including people I'm not going to sit with or anything like that. And George Tenet is a guy who, if you just looked at it on paper and listen to some of the rhetoric around what's happened in our country over the last 20 years, people, again, who don't like the CIA especially, could point to and call a boogeyman. But I read his autobiography after a documentary came out in 2015. It was called Spy Masters in the Crosshairs on Showtime. Did you ever see that?
No, I never did.
So, very cool concept. The two brothers who were on the ground during 9/11 by chance that day, who then happened to film everything, those guys became famous after that. This was another documentary they did, which also was a little bit, certainly a lot reflective for them, because we were focused, the documentary was focusing on the response to the war on terror more than anything, which started that day, essentially. It started before that, but it blew up that day in New York. And so they interviewed every single, at the time, surviving CIA director. So even like George Bush Sr. was being interviewed in that. And by far, to me, the star of the show and the most likable human being on there, and it wasn't close, was George Tenet.
Absolutely. He's a tremendously charismatic person, and it's sincere.
It is so sincere.
He genuinely cares about you. He cared about us. He cares about America. I think he was done a terrible disservice by some people close to him. And so he actually sent me a note. I'll read it to you.
Would love that.
He sent me a note the day before he resigned. And if I can find this here.
What is that, right? That's not a wallet, obviously. Like, is that like a mini notebook?
Yeah. This is the analog version of a digital assistant.
Can I see this real quick?
Well, it's just a, look, see all my...
I'm not going to turn it to the camera, not the papers, but this is great. For people now watching, I'm holding like what's that, about 4-inch, 3.5-inch wallet-looking thing, and it's got cards that look like some of them could be new, and some look like they could be 40 years old.
Let's see here.
Pretty cool.
Find it. I'm still somewhere in here, because I carried this around with me for years. I still have it. So he wrote me this note. He said, "Jim, thank you very much for your note. What you and your team have achieved will rank up there as one of the most spectacular intelligence accomplishments in the history of the CIA. It occurred because of your exemplary leadership. It occurred because of the focus and dedication to mission of terrific men and women. It's testimony to the technical, analytic, surveillance, liaison in a focused, relentless effort. We are absolutely together on disarming a country as a result of your fine work. This kind of effort should be memorialized against very different targets. Your dad would indeed be very proud of you, but no prouder than I am, and I want to come down to see your team. With respect, George J. Tenet."
Wow.
I carry that around because his words meant a lot to me. We loved him. We still do.
Yeah. I'm really happy that I walked into this and you liked him, because like I said, I'm a fan of.
Well, more
of
than
who he
liked
is
him,
as
I
a
love
guy.
the guy.
Yeah.
I think he's tremendous.
Yeah, I think the thing in that documentary that really got me was the combination he had of brutal honesty and emotion. And there were a couple moments that were certainly like, whoa, made me think. But one of them I'm thinking about, where it was a little less emotional but very, very reflective, was he said something to the effect of, and this might be word for word, but let's just say something to the effect of, "I wish the world were a really simple place. I wish it were a place where we could just, understand what the issue is, come together, solve it, and that's it." But that is not reality. The world is extremely complex. It's filled with a lot of different people and all kinds of issues, that some of which are unsolvable.
I think that's wonderful. And he believed that. Very hard-working guy, bright guy, But here he was basically in essence, on duty, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, throughout his time as director.
Yeah, and I guess the takeaway there, for me at least, someone sitting in an armchair here just listening to this kind of thing and who didn't live it, is that, we do try to when we're pointing out all the things that we complain about, we're also, in a way, trying to prove that it should be something that's solvable and solvable in the right way because of this one thing right here. Like, aha, there it is. But that's not at all how it works.
It's not simple. Like I told you earlier, CIA, not Central Insurance Agency.
Yeah.
We take risks for the national security.
Yeah. And with a guy like him, though, you know, like the CIA director role, it's politically assigned, right? You have the president nominate somebody, and sometimes they can nominate someone like Trump nominated Pompeo a few years ago. He was not from in the CIA at all. I think he was like a congressman or something, right? So it's not necessarily going to be someone who's come up through the agency or something like that. But how much effect on the day-to-day does the actual director have, and how much can it change the agency having, you know, a competent director insider versus an incompetent director outsider?
Well, it can mean a lot of difference. The emphasis they put on things, how the workforce perceives the director. Does he have our back? Is he going to protect us? Operations, again, are not 100%. They're inevitably, some of them, even well-conceived ones, are going to go wrong. They will fail. Some of them will. Some of them fail because of circumstances that are far beyond our control. Some of them were ill-conceived to begin with. I mean, the Bay of Pigs is probably a classic one. And there's other, snafus where we probably should not have become engaged. Although, as I've told some correspondents before, I said, you look at any covert action that that the CIA does, and it has been ordered by the White House. We are not the rogue elephant you think we are. It is because the White House has directed us to do something. And sometimes there are very competent people running these operations, and still shit happens sometimes on these things. We are the ones there taking the risks for the United States. And sometimes really good things happen, and sometimes bad things happen. And we do the things at the direction of the president.
For the people out there, though, that don't want to buy something like that, first of all, a lot of them aren't going to be convinced no matter what anyone says.
That's correct.
But in the interest of the people out there who do listen for evidence and do listen to things that make sense to them, a thing that I often struggle with not just the CIA, but any major agency that's involved in national security, think NSA, Homeland Security, FBI now, especially after 9/11. And it's like a lot of the people who work in these agencies have been there for years, right? And sometimes it also is literally the leader of the place is someone who may have been there for 30 years or something. And it's like they have access, especially at CIA and NSA, they have access to the worst, most dangerous shit that exists around the world. And they constantly live in a state of knowing information that the average person they walk on the street can't even fathom is going on, and how much in the snap of a finger a bomb could go off, right? So seeing as they have access to all that, I respect that, and I respect their urgency on issues, and I respect the fact that there's a lot of people who give decades of their life to do this, and they don't make the maximum amount of money that they'd be capable of making. But there's the concept that the politicians who come through these offices, and let's look at the highest office just for the simplicity of this example, the president who comes through is maximum going to be president for 8 years, maybe it's 4. And the people who walk in the first day from the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, whatever, chances are, as a whole, as a collective, these people were there. They were obviously there before the president got there. But more importantly, they're going to be there after this guy leaves.
Correct.
Right? And so a lot of people wonder about that quote-unquote groupthink, almost without planning it, shadow government that forms, in the sense that these agents they're focused on a couple different things. Of course, they're focused on their objectives, but they're also focused on the fact that they want to make sure that they have a job and they're here, and that their value is recognized in the government, because this is their meaning, this is their purpose. And so if someone comes in there, like, let's even point out Trump, who actually was like not from the establishment and didn't really give a fuck what anyone said. If they come in there and you go to them and say, Mr. President, this thing we've been working on for a decade, whatever it is, it's a current danger, here's why. And he looks at you and says, I don't agree, and, you know, takes away the value of your job, you may feel threatened that, like, oh my God, all the shit we're working on, some dude in Washington can just tell us at the stroke of a pen, or a quick comment like that, like, I don't care, we're not doing it. And you may be biased to want to act against their interests. How much of that actually happens? How much of it is you do see high-level people at organizations like this focus on their survival as an organization and for their own job, where it could impact how they butt heads with the people who are elected to call the shots?
So people are people. And I would think that almost all of my colleagues, they might think that, but they also are responsive to a president or an administration. And so as long as we think it's legal and that we're going to follow the president's orders, but they may not like the president. What's been sad for me is that only in recent years have I even known what the politics of my colleagues are. Before, nobody asked. It didn't care if you were a Democrat, a Republican, a Libertarian. Nobody asked. Nobody even. In fact, you could have said, well, what do you think he is? I would have said, I have no idea.
That's how it should be.
Well, that's exactly how it should be. We had no political comments among ourselves. It wasn't like it was forbidden. It wasn't forbidden. It's just nobody, we serve the country. We don't serve necessarily this particular administration as much as we serve the country as a whole. And if this administration in the 70s, we want to normalize relationships with Red China, then we normalized relationships with Red China. We normalized relations with Libya. Look at all the Eastern European countries that used to be our opponents, and now they love us. We were allied with countries that were controlled by the Soviet Union, and there are certain former Soviet republics, Ukraine being a big one, that loves us. And that's good. That's good. But we serve the United States people, and we serve the president, but none of us would talk about, well, this is Republican or this is Democrat. In fact, I have found a uniformity, actually, of good relations between whoever is in the White House and us. When I would have to go downtown and brief some of the Senate leaders on my operations, it didn't really matter to me if they were Democrats or Republicans. They gave us strong support.
That's good to hear. I mean, I think the cynics out there are looking at different things throughout the CIA's history. You mentioned one of them that's at least known, like the Bay of Pigs and things like that. And they see evidence to suggest certainly that there was some CIA involvement, at least members of the CIA involved in the JFK stuff. And they take that throughout the years. They look at things like Operation Northwoods. They look at a guy like Epstein. They look at all these different, quote unquote, potentially linked debacles, right? And it doesn't mean that any or all of them are linked, but there's potential things. And they look at the CIA constantly working to overthrow regimes in other countries. Sometimes I would say probably for the better of the world.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, I don't think we have any involvement in what's going on in Iran at the moment, but I definitely hope that the regime of the mullahs is overthrown. I seriously doubt that we're in there, because we would not want any evidence of CIA involvement. Otherwise, the mullahs would point to, see, it's another CIA revolution. So I'm sure I'm sure that we are being extremely careful. We may emotionally and psychologically be totally on their side, but we would not want a direct CIA connection to what's going on in Iran. These people are coming to their senses. They're going to throw the mullahs out on their asses. That's my fervent hope.
Yeah, actually, let me cut off what I was saying, because I'm more interested in this right now, because you did do, as you've mentioned now several times today, you did extensive work with relation to the Iranian nuclear program.
Right.
So for people out there who are wondering what specifically is going on in Iran right now, and why is this so different from anything we've seen since 1979?
Well, a few years ago, they did have some other riots and things going on. I mean, most of the people in Iran are like a lot of people in America. They're not going to get involved with the government. They just want to live their lives. And I'd say probably that's, 75, 80% of the Iranian people just want to live their lives. And unfortunately, because their government is hostile to our government, their lives have been difficult economically with all the trade sanctions that are on. That's what has motivated Iran, at least originally, to try and have some kind of negotiations with us on their nuclear weapons program. Unfortunately, that's, in abeyance right now, and I fear that the Iranians are, in fact, going to develop a nuclear weapon. I really think that there's strong indications that they will do that. They have a fair supply right now of 60% highly enriched uranium, and that's just a few steps away from weapons grade and something that they need for a working nuclear weapon. Let me say this. My concern is not only that Iran has nuclear weapons, because actually the Iranians are not totally irrational. They know that if they were ever to launch a nuclear strike against Israel, that Israel would obliterate them. What I'm more concerned about is if the Iranians get nuclear weapons, we're going to see other countries in the region and their close neighbors that will feel like we've got to have nuclear weapons too. And the more countries that have that, the chances of an accident or an intentional detonation go up logarithmically. You're going to see somebody will use that in anger.
Yeah, and it is an easy concept for everyone to get a hold of that, we'd like there as few countries as possible around the world to have nuclear weapons. Right. What about the fact, though, that when we ask all these countries or demand of them not to have them, we have a fuck ton of them, though. Psychologically,
so let me ask
why
you this,
does that
Julian.
matter?
Let me ask you this. Yeah. Who would you prefer to have them or us?
You know what I'm going to say.
All right,
us.
Okay. So, for example, some of my friends with good intentions would love for everybody in the world to go to zero nuclear weapons. Yeah. Now, how much do you think I trust the Russians or the Chinese to come down to zero nuclear weapons?
You don't trust them at all.
Zero. No. You've got to have the fact that we are nuclear armed just to dissuade them from doing something. We are much better than either the Chinese or the Russians in conventional weapons. And I actually had a KGB officer I was talking to, and I said something about maybe if we went to zero. And he says, Jim, that's never going to happen because your conventional weapons are much better than ours. The only thing we have are nuclear weapons. And you can't trust them.
My comeback to that, though, is that you're still asking these other countries to not have them, and they could even forget us having them. Right. They could even point and say, well, why the fuck aren't you talking to China and Russia about that? Why should we listen to you?
We have, to give us some credit, we and the former Soviets, the Russians, have reduced the number of nuclear weapons we collectively have. We've come down from tens and tens of thousands to now where I think there's fewer than 4,000 or 5,000. It's still not good.
Right.
It's not good, but it was a lot fewer than it used to be.
It's like a billionaire looking at the person with no money saying, well, I only have $990 million now.
Maybe
things could be worse.
But the fewer weapons we have where you just get down to some bare minimum that we need for national security, I'm fine with that. I think we need to stay on top of the technology. The Russians and certainly the Chinese are improving their nuclear weapons technology, and ours has been kind of at a standstill. I think we are putting some money into next generation things. But, nuclear weapon development went like this, and then it kind of went like this. Because, you can't make it any stronger. We've had multi-megaton weapons. Well, how much more do you need? Now, you might need smaller ones. The reason you want a smaller one is you can throw it further. So that's one thing that we are fearful of, that the more you miniaturize a nuclear weapon, that means you can throw it a lot further and probably more accurately. But as far as nuclear weapons technology itself, it's pretty much stabilized since the 60s.
And back to Iran, though, you're concerned about, for logical reasons too, about them potentially getting a weapon. Quick question to go back maybe 6-7 years, like 14, 15. What were you pumped about the Iran deal?
I was conflicted on the Iran. This is 2015, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action. It's a mouthful, if ever there was.
Always
one.
is.
Yeah. I felt like it's better to talk. You know, Churchill said, better to jaw than war. So if we don't have some kind of agreement, then they're going to maybe feel pushed into a corner to rapidly escalate their nuclear weapons program. But if you ask me, Jim, do you trust them? No, I don't trust them. In fact, my first novel, Living Lies, was all about the United States and Iran having a set of nuclear negotiations, but the Iranians enter into it wanting only one thing, and that's to get the trade sanctions off. We want them to give up their program. They pretend to give up their program, but they secretly move it to another spot because they want an ace in the hole. That was the subject of my first spy novel. And it came about when I was having this discussion with one of my best CIA friends, Rolf Moat Larsen. And my question to him was, Rolf, what if they cheat? And I thought, I'm gonna write a novel about where the Iranians cheat on a nuclear weapons negotiation.
And that becomes something that you got to get sent through the CIA. So they did they did approve it.
Oh, they approved it. Yes, they did. After a year.
After a year. And they redacted some in that first one?
A little bit, about 5 things, a word or two here, a phrase there. None of it, in my opinion, honest opinion, was it classified, but none of it affected the story. So I just thought, okay, I'm not going to argue. You have a right to appeal. You don't have to just automatically take their redactions. You can try and appeal to common sense or say, well, this is very public over here. This has come out, or you've approved it before. That's one thing. If they had approved it in some other books, then I could point to that. But I didn't want to waste another few months doing that. It didn't affect the story, so I just thought, okay, fine, take those offending words out.
And now on the side note, though, you have 2 out. So you did In the Twinkling of an Eye after that as well, and that's another fictional story.
Right. The first one focuses on nuclear weapons. The second one on biological weapons. And the second one, In the Twinkling of an Eye, is about a North Korean and Russian conspiracy to develop a very, very devastating genetic bioweapon, both for assassination but also for genocide. And so both countries have reasons to want things like that. And so in my story, they collaborate on a very secret program, and a very industrious FBI special agent, she recruits a penetration of the Russian program.
Link in description, everybody. I got both books down there. Check them out. They're really, really good. But I've heard you talk about them on other podcasts, and it's like, it's hard for me to not take that leap and be like, that's got to be something that he worked on. Like even that one with Russia and North Korea working together. It's like, we don't think about that. That's never something that's crossed my mind. But chances are, if you're writing something like that, maybe it's not Russia and North Korea, but it's Russia and some other country that you've seen things like this go on.
Right. And I based a number of my characters on actual CIA officers I know in both books. People, especially the good guys. And I would get a friend of mine who I really respect and admire, and I'd say, would you mind if I used you in a book? And I let them pick their own name. They can pick a different name for their character. But it's so much easier for a writer to write about someone he actually knows than trying to just create somebody from whole cloth.
Yeah.
And so I made sure that, that these were part of the good guys. And so a number of my friends are actually in my books. And I respect the real person as much as I do the character.
It's kind of wild that, and I guess like cool that the CIA lets you do that too. And it's not just you. There's other people who've done similar things, but that's that information can be extrapolated for people like me to draw some conclusions.
Well, I can't run real operations anymore, but I can live in my own fantasy world in these books. And I just I live and breathe operations. So I can't run them anymore, but I can have operations in my books. I'm working on a third one, and it's also about spies and treachery.
What specific topic? Is that more like weapons of mass destruction stuff?
I don't think I'm going to have a weapons of mass destruction element in this. This is just pure human treachery. It's called The Traitor's Tale. And it's
Good name.
It's about a CIA officer who is accused of being a Russian mole, and he's not, and he's ultimately exonerated. But during the time he was under suspicion, most of his so-called friends abandoned him, and he's very bitter at this. And so after he's exonerated, he decides, well, fuck them. Now I'm going to really do it. So anyways, this is pure espionage, pure counter-espionage.
And that's something that you were telling me before you're going to have that book finished next year sometime and put it up for review.
Hopefully in the spring, yeah.
Cool.
I need to focus on it and get it done.
We'll definitely have to have you in here when you do that one, too, to promote
you.
that. But one more time, back to finishing up the Iran point, because we've gone off on a couple tangents there. So we talked about the nuclear deal, and you had said the Churchill quote, better draw than war. So you were mixed emotions on it. But fast forwarding to 2022, with the uprisings that are happening, the very basics is that it centers around women's rights within the country. So there was, if I understood this correctly, it started with a young woman who had been arrested for not following certain elements of like Sharia law, and then she died.
She had some, I hate to use the expression wardrobe malfunction, but she had something. She didn't have her hijab on just totally correctly. I think she had it on, but just not 100% the way the morality police, the religious police wanted it. She also was an ethnic minority. She's a Kurd. Okay, yeah. She's not a Persian. She was a Kurd. And sometime between the point when they arrested her and within a few hours, she's dead. And they're claiming, well, she had a heart attack.
Yeah, okay.
Right. Yeah, sure.
22-year-old had a heart attack.
Right, she has a heart attack or something like that. So a lot of women in Iran, and a lot of men too, they've had it up to here with all these people telling them how to live their lives. It's a theocracy, except it's a hypocritical theocracy. So it's no surprise that a lot of the folks in Iran have just got to the bursting point. Now, a lot of them have been killed. Hundreds of these people have been killed.
I think there was like 15,000 protesters or something were just
Well, I hope it's 150,000, but no, I don't think it's 15,000 killed. But I think there's been several hundred killed. I don't follow it that closely. I was having dinner with an Iranian friend the other day, and she said that there's quite a mood of discontent in the country. It's terrible.
Is she like an Iranian and scholar?
Iranian, not a scholar, but she's a professional woman.
I may talk to you about that because I've been working on getting someone who's like an expert on this in here. And
I wouldn't claim that she's an expert, but she's from there, and so
interesting.
Naturally, she has a lot of emotional and family ties back there. I mean, she still has, like most of them, a lot of family.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.